Well, here we are at the final chapter of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16. We have come to the end of our year-long journey through this gospel, and it is my prayer that this has been an opportunity for you to read afresh texts that are familiar, texts we find in some shape and fashion in Mark or in Matthew and Luke, but we in the opportunity of reading all of Mark together, that we see the unique characteristics of Mark's writing and his style and his way of um, uh, showing who Jesus is. This very human Jesus who's always going somewhere immediately. The way that he talks about the disciples, the way that he talks about healings and miracles, and the way that there are puzzles and mysteries and things that people who have ears to hear can hear, and people who have eyes to see can see. And chapter 16 is no no break from that. So this is the story of the resurrection. We're going to look at verses 1 through 8, and we'll talk about why Mark, in most Bibles today, Mark does not end with verse 8, and how we handle that, and a little bit of understanding about why there's more after verse 8. So I'm going to go ahead and read Mark 16, 1 to 8, and then we'll jump in. So when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised, and he is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Gospel of Mark ends there. Now, my NRSV text has two subheadings following this, what's called the shorter ending of Mark, and then the longer ending of Mark. In the NRSV construction, the shorter ending of Mark does not have a verse number attached to it. So basically, it's this extra paragraph that gets tacked on after verse 8. But then the longer ending of Mark begins with verse 9 and goes through verse 20. Before we jump into why those pieces are there and what they mean and what we need to do with them, let's unpack the first 8 verses that are certainly original to Mark. So Jesus has died on Friday, and Joseph of Arimathea places his body, wraps his body, and places it in a new tomb at the end of chapter 15. And the women, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, see where Joseph has placed Jesus's body. And so then Mark tells us that when the Sabbath was over. Now, remember, the way that the Jewish people clocked days was from sundown to sundown. So from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday would have been the Sabbath. So Jesus's body goes into the tomb just before the sun goes down on Friday. And then just as the sun goes down on Saturday, the Sabbath ends. And then the 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, go and buy spices. So just after sundown, the market opens back up, and people are able to purchase things that they need for the next day. And so it and it's, because the sun has just gone down, it's twilight. The market's probably not open very long, but the women are able to go and buy spices, and they're buying those spices because they're going to finish this primary burial, the first burial of Jesus. So then it says, so that they might go and anoint him. And so they would combine the spices that they have, that they've just bought, with some olive oil, and they would anoint his whole body and then rewrap it, and then and leave it in the tomb. That's what they're planning on doing very early the next day. So that's where verse 2 picks up. So very early on the first day of the week. So this is at dawn, as the sun rises on Sunday. Then the women go, and they go to the tomb, and they're going to anoint Jesus's body for burial. They're going to complete the incomplete burial that was done by Joseph of Arimathea because of the time restrictions that were in place because of the Sabbath. So and verse 2, and very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, so the sun is just up, it's getting lighter, they go to the tomb. And they're having this conversation, verse 3 says, about who's going to roll away the stone, because it's really heavy. Who's going to roll away the stone for us? Now, this is very early in the morning. They most likely, they're not the only people awake, but as those shopkeepers are reopening their shops, as people are out tending to animals, people just milling about first thing in the morning, they wonder who's going to help them roll away the stone. And they hope, my interpretation of that is that they hope that somebody that they meet along the way, or somebody that's near the tomb, can help them with enough strength to move the stone. But what they find when they get there is that the stone has already been rolled out of the way, and they're amazed. And they verse 4 says they look up. They may have been looking down at the ground, making sure, because it's very early, looking for rocks and stones so they don't trip. But they look up, they move their eyes from the ground to the horizon, and they look towards the tomb. And when they do, they see that the stone that they were so worried about is already moved. It's already been rolled away. Now, the word there for let's see, for moved, or let's see, that had already been rolled back. So this word here in Mark 16:4 about being rolled back is only used in the Gospels in reference to this particular stone, Jesus, the stone that's rolled in front of Jesus's grave. It occurs 4 times, twice in Mark, once in Matthew, and once in Luke. And it's only used about this particular gravestone. And so the tomb, the entrance to the tomb has been uncovered. And verse 5 says, as they enter the tomb, so they're going to anoint Jesus's body, so they know that they expect Jesus's body to be there and wrapped up, laying on the ledge. And that's not what they find. What they find is a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side. And so this is Mark's way of talking about there being an angel there that is about to tell them something, that's about to reveal something to them. And so they walk in expecting to see Jesus's body. Instead, they see this young man in a white robe sitting on the right-hand side, and they were alarmed. Now, I've told you this before, and I'll tell you again. that when you are confronted with an angel, and in the biblical text, when you're confronted with an angel, that's the proper response, is to be amazed, to be afraid, to be scared. Luke tells us in chapter 2 that when the shepherds met the angel, they were afraid. And so here in Mark, we see that they are amazed. And so the word again, or they're alarmed, is the way that it's translated. They're greatly amazed. They're greatly astonished. They're awestruck. Properly, it means to be out of one's senses with an outcome, and being amazed to the level of wonder. So amazement, wonder, astonishment, all of these things are wrapped up in what the women are feeling in this moment as they encounter Jesus's body being not in the tomb, and this young man wearing a white robe on the right hand side telling them that Jesus isn't there. So he says to them, don't be alarmed, don't be astonished, don't be afraid, don't be awestruck. He says, you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He knows what they're there for. He knows why they've come. He says, and to further emphasize the point, you're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified, meaning he died. You're looking for the one who died here in this tomb, who was placed in this tomb, but he's not here. He has been raised, the angel says. He is not here. Look, he says, he points to it. And he says, look, this is the place where they laid him, and he's not here. And then he gives them instructions. So again, just back up. The women went to the tomb expecting to anoint Jesus' body with spices and oil for the first burial. And then they were expecting about a year later to come back and collect the bones and put them in an ossuary box, which was where that would be his, they would combine the bones together, put it in the box, and then leave it there in the tomb, but make space for other people to be buried in that tomb. So they're amazed that, number one, Jesus isn't there. Number two, that there's an angel there telling them that who they're looking for and why they're there, and that they have work to do. So verse 7, this is what the angel says to the women. It says, but go and tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So he tells them that they're not to stay there. They're supposed to go. Go tell his disciples and Peter. Peter's mentioned specifically for good reason. And then that he's going ahead of you. Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, and you will see him there. Now, so this moment of resurrection, this moment of the empty tomb, the angel tells Mary, and Salome to go and find the disciples and tell them specifically that Jesus is going ahead of them to Galilee. He will meet them there. They will see him. And then they say, and specifically, they say, tell Peter. Now, Peter has the 3 times denial of Jesus that he weeps bitterly at. And so this moment when the angel says specifically to tell Peter isn't necessarily to move Peter to a higher level of importance than the other disciples. It's to remind Peter that he is not beyond redemption, that he messed up huge, and Jesus knows that. Jesus made eye contact with him, and Peter weeps because of that. But this angel wants the women to make sure to tell Peter that he is not beyond forgiveness. He is not beyond redemption. And that's incredibly important. We see in John's gospel that there's this whole scene on the beach between Jesus and, Peter, do you love me more than these? Feed my lambs 3 times. There's this 3 times renewal for the 3 times denial. Mark doesn't have that. John does. But in this moment, Peter is specified out from the rest of the disciples as you need to tell him particularly, because Peter denied Jesus, and so Peter needs to understand that he's not beyond forgiveness. He's not beyond redemption. And then there's the promise that he will meet you there. You will see him just as he told you. And so that was back in chapter 14, verse 28, when Jesus says that he will meet them there. So chapter 14, verse 28 says, "But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." So as Peter is, or as Jesus is predicting Peter's denial, he says, "I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter then says, "Oh, I'll never deny you." And Jesus says, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And so now the angel is telling the women that Jesus will make good on his promise to meet them in Galilee. Then verse 8. This is the last verse of the text for Sunday, the 30th. But it's also this moment where we have to figure out what to do with the ending of the Gospel of Mark. So verse 8, "So they went out," so the women go out, they flee from the tomb, they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Why would you end the gospel like that? Why would you end on a note of fear? Why would you end on a note of silence? These are questions we ask of Mark. Why would you end your gospel this way? And those are questions that have been asked for centuries of Mark's gospel. And the reality is that there's not a whole lot of consensus. There's some consensus around about 4 basic ideas about why does Mark end this way, and what to do about that, and then why there are additional texts versus the shorter ending or the longer ending versus 9 to 20 that are in there. And so, but here's the text here. They went out, they fled from the tomb because terror and amazement, there's that amazement word again, have seized them, has a grip on them, is holding them tight. And they say nothing to anyone. The way we would say it in the South is they said nothing to nobody, because they were afraid. They were terrified. And so they were tremulous. They were shaking and quaking from fear. So the question I asked as I was reading this is, what's the power? Where's the power in the gospel ending with verse 8? What's the power in the narrative and the story that Mark has been telling about who Jesus is by ending at verse 8? So I'll give you my thoughts on it, and then we'll unpack what a few other people think about this. So the appropriate response to meeting an angel is fear, bowing down in reverence, not feeling worthy. So the women's fear response, their amazement response, is appropriate. But it's doubly appropriate at the resurrection because they were not expecting there to be no body in the grave. And so when Jesus's body is not there, and they're given testimony by the angel that Jesus is risen, what it does is it confirms exactly what Jesus has been saying multiple times over throughout the Gospel of Mark. The Son of Man will be betrayed into the hands of sinners. He will be handed over to be crucified, and he will be beaten and flogged and mocked. And they will kill him, and then he will rise on the third day. He said this at the end of chapter 8, the end of chapter 9, the end of chapter 10. And this conclusion to the gospel exactly says, here's what he said was going to happen, and now it has happened. Chapters 14 and 15 talk about the passion narrative and how Jesus was betrayed, and he was tried, and he was beaten, he was crucified, and he died. He was buried. And now chapter 16 tells us that he is alive again. He has risen. He is risen indeed. There is the ending of the story that he said was going to happen. This should be the moment for the women and the disciples to finally hear what Jesus has been saying. This is the moment where all of what Jesus has done comes to fruition. And I think Mark, in his own way, tells us that's exactly what happens. Look at, look at the end of verse 8. They went out, they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now remember, this is early in the morning. They've been told to go and find the disciples and Peter and tell them that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. So when they say nothing to anyone, it feels like Mark is wanting us to hear that the women went directly from the tomb in that fear and amazement and went and found the disciples. And along the way, they said nothing. They didn't stop to talk to the shopkeeper. They didn't say hey to the gardener. They didn't say hi to the shepherd. They went straight to the disciples. They didn't tell anybody anything until they got to the disciples. Now, Mark doesn't say that exactly. He just says they were afraid. They didn't tell anybody anything. But the testimony of Jesus, with Mark being the earliest gospel written, with the testimony that we have from the other three gospels and from the rest of the New Testament, they told people. They told the right people, and the right people told other people, and other people told other people, and the gospel spread. The good news of Jesus, risen from the dead, spread, and the whole world changed. So I can't, I get it. I get that Mark ends on this bit of a mystery, which is what he's been doing the whole time in the gospel. And now we see that Jesus, having risen from the dead, and this angel giving them instructions for the disciples to meet him in Galilee, and for the women to go straight to the disciples, not stopping anywhere, not stopping to have conversations with anybody, but going directly to do what they were asked to do, makes perfect sense for me as I read the end of the Gospel of Mark. Now, as I said before, there's a shorter ending of Mark that's included in the NRSV, and it's sectioned off to note that it is different. And then there's the longer ending of Mark, which is verses 9 to 20, which again is sectioned off in the NRSV text. Your Bible may be different, NIV may be different, some of the others may be slightly different in the way that they format it. But there's this this wondering about the initial question of why would you end your gospel with fear? Why would you end your story of Jesus with the women saying nothing? And so, in order to clean it up a little, there's theories around that that several things might have happened. Something might have happened, um, and it really comes down to which holds the most water for you. And I've been using over the course of this series 5 different commentaries um, on the Gospel of Mark, just the Gospel of Mark specifically, and um, and I've looked at 3 of them already, and all 3 of them disagree with one another. So there's even in modern scholarship, there's disagreement about why Mark would end this way, and which part of Mark is the right ending, and how do we handle that? Okay, so we're going to look at a couple. First of all, N.T. Wright is the commentary that I recommended that at the beginning of this that you take a look at. It's really accessible, and it's just fairly easy to read. So here's what he says. Basically, N.T. Wright basically comes to the conclusion that there is that verse 8 is original, but there was something else that Mark wrote, that got lost somehow. So he says that he says the longer ending looks like a compilation of bits and pieces, but he says that that it is. He says the hold on. He says the ending that the original ending after verse 8 may not have been very long, but it will have been important as the intended conclusion to the book, drawing the themes to their proper destination. So it feels like Mark would have wrapped up things just a little bit differently than just leaving it with the fear and trembling and not telling anybody. He says it's far more likely that he wrote a conclusion in which the women spoke to the disciples went to the tomb, and eventually they went to Galilee and met Jesus again. So, but that somewhere along the way, that particular part of the Gospel of Mark got lost. And he says everything else, whether it's the shorter ending or whether it's the longer ending, verses 9 to 20, are second, third century, or even later additions to the Gospel of Mark that have gotten added into the text. And he looks at the textual evidence for him is that there's lots of language differences, and the style and the form are quite different than the rest of the gospel. So those are other authors adding it, trying to clean it up, trying to make it so that the women do what they're supposed to do, the disciples go, and then the church starts from that point. So Eckhart Schnabel, which is another, this is the Tyndale New Testament commentary on the Gospel of Mark, and he talks about that there are 4 different things. Hold on, it's in his introduction. Like he spends a whole section in his introduction just on this particular issue. All right, like 5 pages on it. So he says there are 4 endings that appear in the manuscript tradition. And the first one, he says the oldest manuscripts of the Greek New Testament end Mark's Gospel at 16:8 and do not contain verses 9 to 20. This is so these are from um, so from the oldest Greek texts, um, these are this is the gospel ends at verse 8. He says there's one manuscript. It's a Latin manuscript that ends the gospel after 16:8 with what the NRSV calls the shorter ending of Mark, and he quotes it specifically. Um, and but he says that it's not original to Mark. So the third option, the third ending, is that there's what we call the longer ending of Mark, and it's attested in 3 5th century manuscripts, and it's found in Greek manuscripts, and it's found in virtually all the Byzantine manuscripts. 2 of which, he says, Erasmus, who's an early church father, used when he produced the first edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516, which he says explains why the longer ending became the standard text until the 19th century. So Erasmus was an early church father, and he produced the first edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516, and included verses 9 to 20 in his edition of the Gospel of Mark. And therefore, as that Greek New Testament was translated into other languages, then verses 9 to 20 got added in until the 19th century. And there were, then there became some textual critics who began to look at that and look at how different it was from the rest, and wonder if it was original or not. The fourth ending, the possible fourth ending, is that that all the way through to verse 20 is just an extended ending, but there are additional insertions. It's called the Freer Logion, and it goes between verses 14 and 15. And my NRSV text has that as a footnote, as an additional insertion. So okay, so there's 4. It ends at verse 8, and that's it. It ends with what's called the shorter ending of Mark. There's all the way to verse 20, and then there's all the way to verse 20 with this additional insertion between verses 14 and 15. So 4 different endings to the Gospel of Mark. So what do we make of all of that? Well, he says the longer expanded ending, this is still with the Freer Logion, is attested in a single manuscript, and he says, and Schnabel says it's hardly original. So he says essentially there are 3 options. First, the longer ending is original, therefore 16 to 20, 16:1 to 20, all the way. And he says there's problems with that because there's some inconsistencies within the text itself. He says if the longer ending were original, there would be no good explanation for its omission, given the endings of Mark and Luke, or excuse me, Matthew and Luke. So then the second option is that Mark's ending was lost before it was first copied. This is kind of where N.T. Wright lands, that after 16:8, there was some kind of original ending that was lost at some point. Now, he doesn't quite buy into that, and because he says that there's a couple of improbabilities. One, that the manuscript of Mark's Gospel deteriorated or was dismembered extremely rapidly within 10 years or so before being used by Matthew and Luke, and precisely at the end of pericope, right at the end of a particular story. So it's like Mark ended verse 8 on the bottom of one page, and then somebody came along and ripped out the next page, or ripped the papyrus or whatever, right at that particular moment. That's probably not what would happen. And that certainly wouldn't have deteriorated due to weather and handling in that particular way. He says, the third solution is that the shorter ending is original. Mark's gospel ended with 16:8. And Schnabel says that's the best way of looking at it, that 16:8 is the way that Mark wanted to end it. And he says that it makes sense because the decisive events in the history of salvation have occurred, and the prophesied appearances will only confirm what the angel has already proclaimed, that Jesus has been raised and yet remains the crucified one. So that's Eckhart Schnabel's thoughts on it. I think there's one more we're going to look at. We're going to look at Ronald Kernaghan's in the InterVarsity Press commentary on Mark. He says that so he says that there are two possibilities, and it's that the original ending may have been lost, and then that the other one is that 16:8 is the intended ending. So he says that his theory is that it's simply implausible that the evangelist, that Mark, was unaware of the accounts of the resurrected Jesus. There is little except conjecture to support the idea that the original ending has been lost. The longer ending conflicts with 16:7 and 16:8 and negates the parabolic character. On the other hand, something is to be said for the idea that Mark intended for the gospel to conclude in this enigmatic way, this mysterious way. If this is so, then the Gospel of Mark ends on the same note with which it opened, a call to repent and believe. So Ronald Kernaghan believes that 16:8 is the original ending, and that fits with the way that the gospel as a whole has been structured. So I've got a couple other commentaries to look through, but I'm going to toss this to you to take a look at, pray through, think about what is it that you want to do with this information. Ask the question, what's the power? Ask the question, what's the power in the gospel ending with verse 8? What's the power in the women walking, fleeing from the tomb with terror and amazement at what they have just experienced? Because it was a complete reversal of what they had expected and anticipated. And they were gripped by it. They're seized by it. It is holding on to their heart. And if they say nothing, if they say nothing to anyone, and they just go, what's the power in that? How does that fit with the rest of the Gospel of Mark? That'll be on the home sheet this week. And it'll be it'll be part of my message as well, because I think that we have the opportunity at the end of the Gospel of Mark to understand that the gift of this open ending, this gift of mystery, is that we're invited into it. We're invited to continue the story. It's not like Luke's gospel, where we go from the end of the Gospel of Luke to the beginning of the book of Acts, and we see what happens. Mark's gospel is just that. It's just the end there. And we see that it's now our responsibility to carry out the message, to not get frozen, but to be captivated by the resurrection and go out into our world and share that. So, all right, that's what I've got for today. I hope this has been helpful. I hope that that this series as a whole has been a blessing to you and to your group members and your class members. Um, and um, and I'm praying about what it is we will do during 2023 for a overarching series for the year. I'll be spending some time in the next month trying to discern that, and figure that out, and plan that out, and plot that out on the calendar in the midst of everything else that's going on. So I appreciate you very much for all that you do for our congregation, for the discipleship life of Wiley UMC. And if there's anything I can do for you, if I can give you a resource or help you find something, answer a question, whatever, please feel free to reach out. And we will look forward to being together again next week as we celebrate All Saints. And so we'll be looking at a passage out of Ephesians. So blessings to you, and look forward to next time. Take care.